Today I want to talk about setting jointer knives. Now we already have a video on this, but we've had a number of comments and I've had a few emails about people wondering what the best way is. And the good thing about woodworking is there's often more than one way of doing things. And it doesn't mean that one way is right and one way is wrong. It just means that there's different ways of doing things. And sometimes that has to do with the equipment that you're using, the wood that you're using. There's all sorts of different variables. And setting jointer knives is one of those situations where there's a few different ways that you can approach it. And today I'm going to talk about why you would do it one way and why you might choose to do it another way. So what I have here, I've actually made a model of what a jointer looks like. So this is the in-feed table here. This would be the cutter blades, and typically there's 3 cutter blades on a jointer, and this would be the outfeed table. And I'm going to do some close-ups of this so that you'll actually be able to see. Because when you're on your hands and knees setting jointer knives or on a little bit of sitting on a stool or something, it's sometimes pretty hard to see exactly what you're doing. So we've got this in large scale so we can see more clearly what I'm talking about. Now before I get started, I want to talk about what we use for measuring devices. Now in the old days we used this kind of a ruler, and you're all familiar with these. They're still available and they still work fine. These are typically wood, although I understand some of them now you can get plastic. Now when I was setting jointer knives in the video, I was actually using a steel rule, and somebody suggested that you might chip the blade, and that's true. So probably the best thing for setting jointer knives is not a steel rule like I showed in the video, even though I do use it, but you do run the risk of chipping a blade. You're probably better with a wooden or even a plastic. A plastic ruler, they're pretty inexpensive, you can get them anywhere, and you won't risk, and they're very accurate too, and you won't have to worry about chipping your blade. So that would be my recommendation in terms of a tool. So let's now look at some of the details. Now let's look at what we talked about in the video. Now what I was taught years ago was that in order to set a jointer knife, you set the knives, all 3 knives, and you need to measure the front and the back of the knife. So it's a bit time consuming. And you set them so that as you turn the wheel, as you turn the blade, now remember this is a model, that as you turn the cutter, it will grab the ruler, lift it up slightly, and move it ahead 1/8 of an inch. Now remember, this is not to scale here, we're just doing this so that you understand how the setting is. So one more time, when you lay the ruler on the outfeed table and slowly rotate the cutter head, it will grab that ruler, lift it up just slightly, and move it ahead 1/8 of an inch. Now that's been a standard for as long as I can remember in setting jointer knives in any of the shops that I've ever worked in. Now today, just for fun, I wondered when I do this what the actual height of that cutter is. And so I've gone about to actually measure how high that blade is. When you do that, how high that blade is from the cutter table. And I don't have really fine, accurate measuring equipment. So the best I have right now is this little digital measuring tool, and the smallest it measures is 1/128th of an inch. That's the finest it does. And I wondered what that would be, and so I looked around. The only thing I could find is a sheet of paper like this. Now this is typical paper that you print from your computer on. It's 20 bond paper, and when I measured 2 thicknesses of it, because this only measures down to 1/128th of an inch, it's about the thickness of 2 sheets of paper. That's what 128th of an inch is. When I actually measured this the height of this, the best I could determine was that that was actually 3, and I cut them up into little pieces like this. The height of that blade, when you do it the way I said, it means the height of that blade is 1/64 of an inch high. And I know that because I used 3 pieces of paper like this and this little measuring device, and it shows 1/64 of an inch. So that's what it is. And if you want to get your own piece of paper and look at how thick that is, that's how high that blade is above the outfeed table. Now, somebody also commented that they actually set theirs at 1/1000th of an inch above the outfeed table, and I have no clue what equipment you would need to measure that. I didn't know what 1/1000th of an inch was, so the only thing I could find that was thinner than the paper was tinfoil, ordinary household tinfoil. And what I found was that if you cut up 8 little bits of this, 8 little bits of this equals 128th of an inch. So what that means is that this paper, this tinfoil, this ordinary household tinfoil, not the thick stuff, but just the regular stuff, is 1/1000th of an inch. So that somebody is able to set their jointer knives as thick as as thin as a sheet of tinfoil. I don't know what equipment you would use to do that, but I don't need that accuracy, and I don't know what equipment you would need to do that, but somebody out there can do that. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is, and what some people are commenting on, is making the blade actually the same height as the outfeed table. Now, in that case, you would use the same ruler, but you would drop, I'm just pulling out this piece of wood here to drop that blade down. So in that case, this blade would actually be, when you rotate this blade, now in this case it's actually lifting the ruler up, but it would be even, absolutely even on the front and the back, exactly even with the outfeed table. And neither one of these are right or wrong. The advantage with having the blade absolutely even with the outfeed table means that you're not going to get any snipe in a board. And in a minute I'll draw that on the blackboard to remind you what snipe is. So you could do that if you were cutting wood that you absolutely did not want any snipe on. That's what you would use. Now, from time to time I make musical instruments, and the fingerboards are often ebony. Ebony is very expensive wood, and you only buy small parts of it or small pieces of it. And on something like that, I don't want any snipe. I don't want to have to be resanding the whole thing down. I want it to be perfect. And in those few instances, I will set the jointer knives for one cut. I will actually set those jointer knives absolutely even with the top of the table so that I don't get snipe. Now, the problem with setting the blade at the exact height of the outfeed table is this. If this blade falls below the height of this table, what happens is your cuts are not flat. Your wood is not going to be, when you run your wood across, it is not going to be flat. It actually is bowed like that. Your wood, now obviously not that extreme, but there is a bow, and the deeper that this goes, the more the bow is. So for a lot of things it doesn't really matter, but if you're trying to glue boards together and they're all bowed on both sides, you can't even glue boards together properly. So the risk that you run of using this, of having this here, is of having the blade actually fall below the table. And sometimes all it takes is a few pieces of wood, depending on the wood that you're using, that you'll actually take enough of an edge off that that blade now drops below this outfeed table. So that's the risk of doing that. Now, the other problem with setting it exactly like this is that you probably need to keep checking it, because if you're running a few boards and you run some wood, and you probably need to keep checking your boards, because you're not going to want bowed boards to be coming out the end. So it means that you may need to keep adjusting your knives depending on what your equipment is and how easy or hard it is to set up your jointer. With this methodology, you may have to set your knives more often. So it means you're going to be playing around setting up equipment more often. For me, and for most of what I do, setting the blade the way I said in the video, so that it grabs the ruler very slowly as you rotate this, it grabs the ruler, lifts it up, and drags the ruler forward by 1/8 of an inch, is as accurate as the wood that I'm using for 99% of the materials and the projects that I'm making. So that's the difference. Those are the pros and cons. And when I have the blade nicely above, and in this case I've actually measured it, it's at 1/64 of an inch above the blade. And if you don't know, if you wonder again what 1/64 of an inch, these little razor blades that you can get for your tools, this is thicker than a 1/64 of an inch. It's actually 3/128, so it's by 1/28 of an inch. It is thicker. So the height, if you look at a razor blade, one of these sort of industrial razor blades that you can buy at all the hardware stores, look at how thin that is. If you follow my procedure, then your cutter blades are actually going to be a little bit less than that above the height. So that's a pretty small amount of snipe to be worried about. And speaking of snipe, let's go to the blackboard and review what snipe is. So when we talk about snipe, here's what we're talking about. Here's the top of a board. There's the leading edge, and here's the trailing edge. And if you assume that this board is going to be traveling this way through the jointer, just like our model showed here, what happens is this area will be all nicely flat, but at the very end, and depending on what equipment you have, the size of your jointer and so on, at the very end there will be something called snipe. And what that is it's a little sort of an indentation. And if we enlarge that, the very end of the board would look like this. Now that's obviously very exaggerated, but this area in here, this is called the snipe. Now if you're cutting your wood, if you're using raw wood and you're having to plane it and cut it to size and width and everything from rough cut lumber, I'm going to do a video very shortly on the procedure. There is a procedure for cutting rough cut lumber, how you go about doing that. And typically what I'm going to be showing you in that video is that typically when you have snipe, in many cases you actually should be cutting off the board before that, or at the end of that snipe anyway, because out here in most cases is where checking in the wood has already occurred, and you want to cut that off, so at the same time you're cutting out the snipe. So that's what snipe is, and that's how it relates to cutting wood on your jointer. And so, as I said at the beginning of this video, there's often different ways of doing things in woodworking. That's one of the nice things about it. There's more than one way of accomplishing your end goals. And today I've just showed you two different ways of setting up your jointer knives. Neither one of them is right or wrong. It just depends on your equipment, it depends on the job that you're doing, and how much time you want to spend in setting up your jointer knives and your tools, and what sort of accuracy you need. And all of those things are going to help determine which is best for you. So, I'm Colin Canet for Woodwork Web. I want to thank you for watching, and we love to hear your comments. So if you've got comments on this video, good or bad, or other suggestions, we love to hear all of those. So please feel free to send your comments to us, because we all learn things from this. I'm Colin Canet for Woodwork Web. Thanks for watching.